The darkness under Moria did not care about plans. This is the first thing to understand, not Gandalf's death, not the specific mechanics of what happened on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, but the indifference of the darkness itself, the way it received the fall of one of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth with the same silence it received everything else. The abyss did not mark the moment. The mountain did not shudder. The Balrog fell and Gandalf fell with it, and the world above continued in exactly the way the world continues when something irreplaceable is lost, which is to say, without acknowledgement, without pause, without any of the ceremonial weight that the moment deserved. The 8 who remained came out of Moria into the light of a grey morning and fell apart on the hillside. Not figuratively. Literally, they came through the eastern gate and the light hit them, and whatever had been holding them together in the darkness, the specific compression of shared terror that functions as a kind of unity, released all at once, and they became 8 separate people again instead of one moving thing, and the grief arrived with the light in the way that grief waits for safety before it fully comes. Aragorn was the first to speak. He said, "Move." He said it not because moving was the right response to what had just happened, but because standing still on the hillside below Moria's eastern gate was a way of dying, and dying was not something he was prepared to authorize for anyone in his company while he had any say in the matter. So he said move, and they moved, and the moving was the first decision made in a world that no longer had Gandalf in it, and it was the right decision, and it was a decision that Aragorn made alone because there was no one else to make it. This is what his absence meant, immediately and practically, not the loss of wisdom or power or the deep knowledge of the world's history that Gandalf had carried in his grey wanderer's mind, though all of those losses were real and would become more real as time went on. What it meant immediately was that someone had to decide, and the someone was Aragorn, and Aragorn had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of responsibility and had spent approximately the same amount of time hoping it would not be required of him in quite this form. He had been raised in Rivendell under a name that was not his own, trained by Elrond in the arts of both war and healing, sent out at 20 into the wilderness to learn what the world actually was rather than what the histories said it had been. He had spent decades as a ranger, as Thorongil in Gondor's service, as a wanderer in lands that did not know his name or his lineage, developing the specific competence of someone who has been prepared for great things and then placed in circumstances where great things were not available and small things had to suffice. He had done this for 87 years. He was good at it. He was perhaps the best person alive at making decisions in the dark without the information the decision required. He made the decision. He would keep making decisions. This was what leadership meant in the absence of the person who was supposed to be leading, not inspiration, not wisdom, not the right words at the right moment, but the grinding daily work of choosing when choosing was the only alternative to stopping, and stopping was not survivable. The grief he would process later. There would be time for grief when there was time for anything except the next step, and the next step was Lothlórien, because Lothlórien was the only place within reach that offered rest and safety and the kind of counsel that the company now desperately needed. Gandalf had known Galadriel. He had known what she would offer and what she would ask and what the mirror showed and what it was worth to have seen it. Without Gandalf, they were going to Lothlórien without a map, without context, without the interpreter who had understood both sides of every significant conversation since Rivendell. They were going anyway, because there was nowhere else. Legolas walked at the front. This was not deliberate arrangement, it was the natural movement of someone whose senses extended further than the others, whose elvish perception of the forest around them was the closest thing the company had to early warning. He walked with the particular quality that elves brought to grief, which was not the suppression of it, but its integration. Elves had been grieving since the First Age and had developed a relationship with loss that was less about recovery and more about continuation, the understanding that grief was not a temporary state to be moved through but a permanent layer of experience to be walked with. He had known Gandalf since before most of the other company members had been born. He had known him in the way that elves knew things, not as a human life is known, with a specific beginning and middle and end that make a person comprehensible as a narrative, but as a presence, constant, something that had been part of the texture of the world for as long as the world had its current texture. Gandalf arriving in a place was the world being itself. Gandalf absent was the world missing something structural. He walked. He did not speak about this. He filed it in the part of himself that would eventually need to be spoken about and kept moving. Gimli walked behind him. The relationship between them, this dwarf and this elf, this ancient antagonism between peoples that ran back to grievances older than either of them, had been changed by Moria in ways that neither of them had language for yet. They had fought together in the dark. They had been afraid together, which is a more intimate thing than fighting together, and they had both come out of it alive, and the coming out alive together had the specific weight of shared experience that crosses boundaries that philosophy and history cannot. Gimli was also, under the grief and the stubborn forward motion, doing something that he would not have admitted to anyone in the company. He was thinking about Berlin. About the tombs they had found in Moria, about the record of the dwarven colony that had gone there to reclaim Khazad-dûm and had died there instead, about the specific quality of reading the last entries in a log and understanding that the people writing them knew what was coming. Berlin had been in the company that found the One Ring, had been there when Bilbo found it, had been part of Thorin's company when the world had first begun moving in the direction that had brought Gimli here. And Berlin was dead in Moria. And Moria was behind them. And Gandalf was dead in Moria too. The dwarfs had a word for the specific grief of a people returning from a place that has taken everything, not just the people who went in, but the possibility of the place being what it once was. Gimli carried this word internally and did not translate it and walked. Boromir walked beside Aragorn. This was the most complicated position in the company, and Boromir knew it and Aragorn knew it, and neither of them spoke about it because speaking about it would have required naming things that were not yet ready to be named. What had happened between them at the Council of Elrond, the tension over the ring, the divergent views of what it was and what it could be used for, had not resolved. It had simply been submerged under the immediate necessities of the Fellowship's journey, the way disagreements are submerged when survival requires cooperation and cooperation cannot afford the luxury of disagreement. Boromir was not a villain. This is the most important thing to say about him, the thing that the simplified versions of the story always get wrong. He was a man of extraordinary ability and genuine courage who loved his city and his people with the specific intensity of someone who has watched them diminish for years and has been unable to do anything adequate about the diminishing. He carried Gondor the way a person carries a wound, constantly, below every other experience, shaping the quality of everything that touched it. He wanted the ring not because he was corrupt but because he was desperate, and desperation in a man of Boromir's intelligence and will produced a form of reasoning that was genuinely sophisticated and genuinely wrong simultaneously. He walked beside Aragorn and said nothing about the ring and thought about the ring and did not say anything about thinking about it, and Aragorn was aware of all of this and also said nothing, and the silence between them had the specific quality of a tension that had not yet become a crisis, and both of them knew it was going to become one eventually. They reached Lothlórien. The borders of the Golden Wood felt different without Gandalf. Not hostile, Haldir and the Wardens received them with the courtesy that Lothlórien maintained toward travelers who came in peace, with the additional weight of elvish perception reading the company and understanding immediately that something was wrong, that the number was not what it should have been, that the 9 who had left Rivendell had become 8. Haldir looked at them with the expression of someone reading a text and finding a page missing. "The Grey Pilgrim," he said. It was not a question. "Moria," Aragorn said. He fell. Haldir was quiet for a moment, the elvish quiet that processed information at a depth that human quiet did not reach. Then he led them in. Galadriel received them in the way she received things that confirmed her deepest fears, with complete stillness, with the quality of attention that had nothing performative in it, with the face of someone absorbing a reality they had already half anticipated and finding that anticipation provides no meaningful protection against arrival. She had felt it before they reached her borders. Nenya had told her in the way that Nenya told her things, not in words, not in images, but in the specific texture of the world's changed quality, a note gone missing from a chord she had been hearing for 2,000 years. She stood before them in the twilight of Karaz Galadon and she looked at 8 faces where there should have been 9 and she said nothing for a long time. She was thinking about the last time she had seen him. About the conversation they had had, one of hundreds, thousands, across 2,000 years of his presence in Middle-earth. But this one had the quality of a conversation she had not known was final and was now reassessing as such. She was thinking about what he had said and what she had said and what had been left unsaid in the way that things are left unsaid between people who expect more time. There was not more time. There never was. She had learned this more times than she had wanted to learn it, and she had never developed immunity to the lesson. Then she said, "You will not return." Not a question. Not even quite a statement. The words had the quality of something being confirmed rather than communicated, a fact being spoken aloud for the first time in a room where it had already been fully known. Aragorn said, "No." She looked at him. She had known him since he was a child, had watched him become what he was becoming, had seen in him the specific convergence of lines that the world had been building toward for 3,000 years. She looked at him now with the assessment of someone measuring a thing against the requirement it will be asked to meet, and she found the measurement, not comfortable, not reassuring, but honest, which was what she had always offered him in place of comfort. "You will have to be more than you plan to be," she said. "I know," he said. Sooner than you are ready. I know that too. She looked at each of them in turn, Legolas with his integrated grief, Gimli with his dwarven word for a specific kind of loss, Boromir with his wound, the hobbits who were young enough that Gandalf's death was still arriving rather than arrived. She looked at Frodo last and longest, and what she saw when she looked at Frodo was the thing she always saw when she looked at Frodo, the thing she did not have a word for in any language, the quality that had no name because nothing had previously required it to be named. She let them rest. She gave them the specific hospitality of Lothlórien, which was unlike any other hospitality in Middle-earth, the sense of existing outside ordinary time, of being held in something that had not yet agreed to be part of the diminishing world, the light of the Malorn trees, the food that tasted like memory rather than sustenance. She let them grieve, which is a form of hospitality that is less often recognized as such and no less necessary. The grief took different forms. Legolas sat in the highest branches of a Malorn tree and sang something that had no words in any tongue the other members of the company recognized, a melody that communicated its meaning through structure rather than language, through the way it moved rather than what it said. Gimli sat below and listened and did not admit that he was listening. Sam cried without embarrassment, which was the most hobbit-like thing about him and one of his finest qualities. Pippin and Merry cried together in the way of people who had known each other long enough to not require privacy for grief. Boromir sharpened his sword and did not cry, and the not crying was its own kind of grief, the kind that happens when a man has decided that grief is a luxury he cannot afford and has believed this for long enough that the belief has become indistinguishable from the man. Aragorn sat alone for a long time. He was thinking about the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, about what Gandalf had said before he fell, not the famous words, not the "you shall not pass" that would be remembered in every account written afterward, but the earlier thing, the quieter thing, the way he had spoken to each member of the company in Moria when the situation had become clear, as if he had known he was distributing something he would not be able to give later. He had said something to Aragorn that Aragorn had not fully processed in the moment because the moment had not allowed for processing, and he was processing it now. He had said, "The question was never whether you were ready. The question was whether you would go anyway." Aragorn sat with this and thought about what it meant to go anyway and came to the conclusion that it meant exactly what it said, no more and no less, and that no amount of sitting with it would produce a more comfortable meaning. He stood up. He went to find the company. Frodo she spoke to alone. She brought him to the mirror and she showed him nothing, or rather, she showed him the mirror and let it show him what it chose to show him, which was her practice with the mirror and which produced, in Frodo's case, images she observed from the side of his face rather than from the surface of the water. She watched him look and she watched his face do the things a face does when it is looking at a future it does not want to be true. She did not tell him what she saw when she looked at him. What she saw was not something that would have been useful for him to know, not because she wished to deceive him but because there are things that knowledge of ruins before they can be done, and what she saw in Frodo Baggins was something that depended for its possibility on not being seen too clearly in advance. She saw a hobbit who was already being consumed. Not quickly, the ring did not work quickly on those it was not designed for, those outside the specific categories of being it had been made to dominate. It worked slowly on hobbits, which was in one sense mercy and in another sense the particular cruelty of a long diminishment rather than a quick one. She saw a creature of the Shire, of pipeweed and second breakfasts and the profound ordinariness of a people who had built their entire civilization around the principle that nothing too exciting should ever happen, a creature fundamentally unsuited to what was being asked of him, carrying it anyway, being unmade by the carrying with every step. And she saw, underneath all of this, something that she did not have a word for in any language she spoke, and she spoke most of them. Something that was not strength exactly, not courage in the conventional sense, not the quality that songs called heroism. Something smaller and more stubborn than any of those things. Something that had no name because it had never needed one before, because nothing had ever required it to be named, because the history of the world had never previously produced a situation in which this specific quality in this specific kind of person was the decisive factor. She looked at it for a long time. Then she let him go. She gave him the file. Light of Eärendil, the oldest light in the world, captured in glass, she gave it to him and said what she said and meant every word of it and knew, as she watched him leave her mirror garden, that meaning every word of it and the words being sufficient were two different things. She spoke to Boromir. This is not in most accounts, because Boromir did not speak about it afterward and Galadriel does not narrate her own conversations, but it happened. She sought him out on the third evening in Lothlórien, finding him on a platform in the Malorn trees looking south toward Gondor with the specific quality of a man looking at something too far away to see and looking anyway. She sat with him. She did not begin with the ring. She began with Gondor, with the city itself, the White City, which she had seen in its glory in the Second Age and had watched diminish across the centuries with the patient grief of someone who remembers what things were and cannot prevent them from becoming what they are. She spoke about it with the kind of love that is possible for someone who is not from a place and has spent enough time in it to love it without the complicated ownership that belonging produces. Boromir listened. He had not expected to be listened to about Gondor, had expected what he always received from elves, which was the polite acknowledgement of its existence as a human kingdom, significant but not the kind of significant that elven memory organized itself around. Galadriel spoke about it differently. She spoke about it as if it mattered in the way it mattered to him. Then she said, "The ring will not save it." Boromir did not respond immediately. He looked south for a while longer. "I know," he said finally. "I have always known. The knowing does not change what I feel when I think about what it could do." "No," she said. "It never does. The knowing and the feeling are not in conversation with each other. They live in different parts of us and they do not communicate, and this is one of the fundamental difficulties of being a person." She paused. "The ring knows this. It works in the space between the knowing and the feeling. It makes itself feel like the answer because it understands that answers feel different from arguments." Boromir was quiet. "What happens when I go back without it?" he said. It was not a question about strategy. It was a question about himself, about what he would be, in Gondor, without the thing he had told himself would solve the unsolvable problem. "You go back as yourself," Galadriel said. "Which is more than most men are. And Gondor faces what Gondor faces, and some of it will be survived and some of it will not, and this is not a different situation than the one Gondor has been in for centuries." She looked at him with the directness that 15,000 years made available. "You already know how to do what is necessary without the ring. You have been doing it your entire life. The ring was not your hope, it was your despair wearing hope's face." Boromir sat with this for a long time. The malon leaves moved above them in a wind that was specific to Lothlórien, a wind that felt intentional rather than atmospheric. He would have said something like that, Boromir said. The Grey Wizard. He would have found the plain version of what you just said and he would have said it less elegantly and it would have landed the same way. "Yes," Galadriel said. "He had a gift for plainness. We needed him." "Yes," she said. "And you do not have him. And this is the situation, and the situation will not change by being grieved at, though grieving is still the right response." She stood. "Use your grief, son of Gondor. Let it tell you what matters. The thing that hurts when it's gone is the thing worth protecting." She left him there. He sat for a while longer in the malon tree looking south. Something had shifted in him, not resolved, not healed, not the dramatic transformation that stories assign to moments of insight. Just shifted. The weight distributed differently. The desperation less absolute. He came down eventually and went to sleep and dreamed about the White City in the way he always dreamed about it, as a fact rather than a hope, as the thing that existed rather than the thing that needed to be saved, and the distinction between those two orientations was smaller than it sounds and meant everything. The fellowship broke at Amorn Hen. This too happened as it was always going to happen, as it had been building towards since Rivendell, since the divergent purposes in the company had been present from the beginning. Boromir cornered Frodo on the hill and he made his argument, and the argument had changed, not in its conclusion, which was still that Gondor needed help and the ring was the help that was available, but in its quality. The desperation was still there, but underneath it was something else, something that Galadriel had put there or uncovered, the awareness that the argument was also a plea, and the plea was not about the ring. He said, "I need you to understand what we are facing." Frodo said, "I do understand. I have been carrying it since Bag End." And something in Boromir understood that this was true, that the hobbit in front of him, this small impossible creature who had carried the ring from the Shire through Moria through Lothlórien, understood the weight of it in a way that Boromir's understanding of weight had not fully accounted for. He reached for the ring anyway. The ring was still the ring and Boromir was still desperate, and understanding and action do not always align. Frodo put on the ring and ran. He ran to the seat of seeing, and the vision found him there, the eye, the attention of something immense and patient and entirely without mercy sweeping toward him across the miles. He made the decision that the vision forced on him, the decision that Gandalf had always been steering him toward without being explicit about it, alone. He had to go alone. The Fellowship was a wound in the plan, everyone around him was a target, a vulnerability, a person the ring could use to reach him or could simply destroy in the reaching. He went to the boats. He was pushing off when Sam arrived, wading in with the specific determination of someone who has made a decision so fundamental it doesn't register as a decision. "I made a promise, Mr. Frodo," Sam said. "Don't you leave him," Gandalf said. And I don't mean to. The words hit Frodo differently than they would have a day earlier. Gandalf had said this. Gandalf had looked at Sam Gamgee in the Shire and seen something worth the instruction, had understood that whatever happened, whatever the journey required, Sam was the element that couldn't be removed. He pulled Sam into the boat. They went east together. Meanwhile on the shore below Amorn Hen, Boromir was dying. He had gone after Merry and Pippin, not strategically, not because he had analyzed the situation and determined it was the right move, but because two members of his company were being taken by Uruk-hai, and stopping this was what you did, what his entire life of soldiering had trained him to do without requiring a decision. He fought until the arrows found him, and he kept fighting after the first arrow, and after the second, and it was the third that brought him to his knees. Aragorn reached him. The conversation between them was brief and it was everything. Boromir said, "I tried to take the ring. I am sorry." Aragorn said, "You fought for your company, you kept faith." Boromir said, "Gonda," and did not finish the sentence. Aragorn finished it for him with a promise that was also a declaration, the first time he had claimed what he was in a way that admitted no ambiguity: "I will not let the White City fall." Boromir looked at him and said, "My captain, my king," and died. Aragorn held him for a moment. Then he stood. What came next was the first real test of leadership without Gandalf, not the logistical test, not the keep moving that he had been doing since Moria, but the strategic test, the moment where multiple necessities competed and choosing between them meant accepting what you could not do. Frodo and Sam were gone. He could see the boat on the water, the two small figures crossing toward the eastern shore. He could not follow them into Mordor without defeating the purpose of their going alone, could not catch them without the boat, could not help them from here. Merry and Pippin were alive. The tracks told him this. They had been taken east toward Rohan, toward the plains, by a company of Uruk-hai that moved faster than men but could be tracked. He chose. "We are not going to Mordor," he said to Legolas and Gimli. "We are going after Merry and Pippin." Gimli looked at him. "The ring." "Frodo has made his choice," Aragorn said. "We honor it by not undoing it. We can still save two members of this company who are alive and retrievable." He looked at the eastern shore where the boat had reached, the two figures pulling it onto land, beginning to climb. "Frodo does not need us behind him. He needs whatever help we can give him that isn't behind him. We give that help by keeping the war in the west from becoming the only thing Sauron needs to concentrate on." It was not the argument Gandalf would have made. Gandalf would have known more, would have had the context that made the argument complete, the knowledge of what Fangorn held and what Rohan needed and what the Ents were contemplating and how all of these things fit together in the larger pattern. Aragorn was making the argument from what he could see, which was less, and trusting that what he could see was enough to act on. They ran. 3 hunters crossing the plains of Rohan with the specific urgency of people who have converted grief into motion and are not yet ready to let the motion stop, because stopping means facing what the motion is keeping at bay. They ran for 3 days at a pace that was not human even by Dunedain standards, reading the trail with the precision that Aragorn had developed over decades of ranging, tracking, learning the grammar of disturbed earth and broken grass and the specific vocabulary of passage that different creatures left in different landscapes. The plains of Rohan were not empty. They were watched, not by enemies, but by the Rohirrim, the horse lords who maintain sovereignty over this landscape the way a people maintains sovereignty over the land they know better than anyone else. Ema found them or they found Ema, which amounted to the same thing, and the meeting was the kind of meeting that happens when two kinds of competence encounter each other and recognize what they are looking at. Ema told them, the Uruk-hai were destroyed. He told it with the flat directness of a soldier who is used to delivering reports and does not embellish them. The orcs were dead, the company gone. He had seen no hobbits. He thought they might have gone into Fangorn. He also told them, in the way that soldiers tell things that are adjacent to the main report, that Theodred was dead, the king's son, the heir to Rohan, dead in a battle at the fords of Isen that should not have been as costly as it was, but had the quality of a battle that was managed rather than simply fought, directed toward an outcome that someone with sufficient information had decided in advance. Aragorn heard this and filed it with the other information he was accumulating about a world that was moving faster than it should have been moving, that had the quality of a plan executing rather than events unfolding. Without Gandalf he had no one to consult about the plan's architecture. Gandalf would have known whose plan it was and what the next move was and how the pieces fit together. Aragorn had the pieces and had to do his own fitting. They went to Fangorn. The forest received them in the way that Fangorn received everything, with an H-weight that had nothing to do with hostility and everything to do with depth, the sense of something that had been present long enough to find the visit of individual mortals interesting in the way a mountain finds weather interesting. They moved through it carefully, with the quality of people who understood that they were guests in something much older than themselves. They found Merry and Pippin first, which was the best possible outcome, and also, given where Merry and Pippin were, complication. Merry and Pippin had found Treebeard. This requires a moment of context that the simplified histories often skip. Treebeard was not an ally in the way that alliances are usually formed. He was not sympathetic to the cause of the West because he understood its stakes and had made a calculation about which side to support. He was sympathetic to nothing in the way that anything younger than 1,000 years was sympathetic to things. He was ancient and he was slow, and he was making decisions on a timescale that made the urgency of the current war feel like a brief inconvenience in a much longer reckoning. What Merry and Pippin had done, through no strategy, through the simple fact of being the kind of people they were, curious and talkative and genuinely interested in things, was accelerate his timeline. They had spent days with him, being carried through Fangorn, learning the Entish relationship with time and patience and the specific quality of anger that grows slowly enough to be mistaken for patience until it isn't. And they had told him about Saruman. Not strategically. They had simply told him what they knew, the way you tell things to someone who is listening carefully and who you have begun to trust, and what they knew about Saruman included the specific detail that Saruman's axes had been cutting Fangorn for decades, that the trees they were walking through were being reduced at the eastern edge to feed his furnaces, that the forest was being used without regard for what the forest was. Treebeard had listened to this with the expression that very old things have when they are processing something they have known for a long time and have finally decided to stop knowing it quietly. When Aragorn arrived with Legolas and Gimli, Treebeard looked at them with the specific attention of something that has been deciding whether to move for a very long time. "You are the ones who run," he said. It was not a criticism. It was an observation from something that did not run, that found the concept interesting. "Yes," Aragorn said. "Where are you running to?" "Rohan," Aragorn said. "The king is needed in Rohan." Treebeard was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The Ents have been talking. We have been talking for several days, which is brief by our measure, and we have reached a decision." He looked at the forest around him, at the trees that were his people and his responsibility and his grief. "We are going to Isengard." Aragorn looked at him. He thought about what this meant, what the Ents moving meant, what Isengard falling meant, what the timing of all of it meant in relation to the war that was coming at Rohan from multiple directions simultaneously. He did not have Gandalf's knowledge of how these pieces fit together. He had his own intelligence, and the intelligence was telling him that this was important, was probably essential, and that the right response was not to manage it but to go where he was needed and trust that the ancient things were also going where they were needed. "Go well," he said to Treebeard. "Rum," said Treebeard. "We will go as we go." Which is not well or badly but thoroughly. They left Fangorn. They rode for Edoras. Edoras in the early days of the war was a city in the process of forgetting itself. This is the most accurate description available, not under siege, not visibly destroyed, but hollowed out from the inside, the life of the place draining away like color from a cloth left in the sun, the vibrancy that Rohan at its best possessed replaced by a grey flatness that was not peace but was peace's convincing imitation. Theoden King sat in the hall of Meduseld and had been sitting there, in effect, for years. The man inside the king had not left all at once. These things never happened all at once. The ring had taught Galadriel this, and Theoden's situation was a variation on the same principle, the slow replacement of one thing with something that resembled it and was not it. Wormtongue had been patient. Wormtongue had been patient in the specific way of someone who had received careful instruction in patience from a teacher who understood that the most durable corruption was the kind the corrupted person never fully recognized as corruption. Aragorn came into Meduseld with Legolas and Gimli and the two surviving hobbits, and he came in the way he had learned to come into places over 7 years of doing exactly this, as himself, fully, without armor or performance, as the person he was rather than the person the situation required him to perform being. This was perhaps his most distinctive quality and the one that was hardest to explain from the outside. His authority was not performed. It simply existed, the way the authority of old mountains exists, as a fact of presence rather than a declaration. Wormtongue moved to intercept them. Wormtongue was good at interception. It was his primary function in this hall, the filtering of access to the king, the management of what reached Theoden and in what form. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for years and had refined it to the point where refusal felt like courtesy. Aragorn looked at him and said nothing for a moment. Then he looked past him at Theoden. He did not speak to Wormtongue. He spoke to the king. He spoke to him in the way he had spoken to Boromir in the cave of Moria, directly, as one person to another, without the mediation of titles or roles or the social architecture that had been built around the king to keep the king from being reached. He spoke to him as a man who was also a man, in the plain language of someone who had spent most of his life in the wilderness where there was no one to perform for and performance had become less available as a mode of address. He said, "King." He said it as a fact, not a greeting, not a title. The fact of what Theoden was, addressed to the part of Theoden that had always known what it was and had not been able to get to that knowledge through the layers of Wormtongue's patient work. Something moved in Theoden's eyes. It was not instantaneous. It was not the dramatic restoration that would have been available with a wizard present, with the specific authority of someone trained to undo exactly this kind of work. It was slower and messier and more human, the slow movement of a mind coming back to itself from a long distance, the specific disorientation of someone who has been somewhere they did not know they had gone and is beginning to map the distance. Wormtongue tried to speak. Gimli picked him up and moved him sideways, which was not subtle and was extremely effective. Aragorn kept talking to Theoden. Kept talking to the king in there, to the man who had been Theodred's father and Eowyn's uncle and Rohan's king and had been displaced from all of these things by slow patience and careful work. He talked about the war. He talked about what was coming. He talked about the fords and Theodred and what the scouts had reported about the Uruk-hai assembling in the west. He talked in the way that a man talks to someone he believes is still there, still capable of being reached, still worth the effort of being talked to honestly rather than managed. Theoden straightened. Not all at once. It was a process, the shoulders first, then the head, the posture of a man remembering that posture was something he controlled rather than something that happened to him. He looked at Aragorn with eyes that were coming back into focus the way eyes come back into focus in the morning, slowly, with the sense of a world reforming from blur into specificity. He said, "How long?" Aragorn said, "Long enough that we do not have long." Theoden sat with this. He looked at Wormtongue, who was being held against a pillar by a dwarf and was wearing the expression of someone whose careful work of years has been undone with a speed that the work itself could not have anticipated. Theoden looked at him and felt the specific quality of understanding that arrives when you realize what has been done to you, not anger first, the anger came later, but first the cold clarity of a man understanding the shape of his recent past from outside it for the first time. "Get him out of my hall," Theoden said. It was done. What followed was the war without a wizard, the war that had no White Rider appearing at dawn, no staff raised against a darkness that the staff could dispel, no voice that could command the ringwraiths away from their purpose. What followed was the war as human beings and dwarfs and elves and hobbits fight wars when they fight them without the intervention of the divine, which is to say with whatever they have, which is never enough and is always what there is. They rode to Helm's Deep. The decision was tactical and was wrong, which is the nature of decisions made with incomplete information in insufficient time. Helm's Deep was defensible in the narrow sense of the word, its walls were thick, its position in the deep encombe created a natural funnel that disadvantaged attackers in numbers, the Hornburg had held against assault before. What it was not was a position from which anything could be accomplished except surviving the night. And surviving the night, without the dawn reinforcement that no one was coming to provide, was going to be the work of 10,000 Uruk-hai against 300 Rohirrim and whatever the Fellowship's remnant could contribute. Aragorn arrived at Helm's Deep and immediately understood the arithmetic. He did not share this arithmetic with the people around him, not because he was deceiving them but because the arithmetic was not actionable. Knowing the numbers were wrong did not change the numbers, and the only contribution that numbers could make to the morale of soldiers who were about to defend an inadequate position was a negative one. He moved through the preparations with the quality he brought to everything in this period, present, precise, refusing despair as a performance while not denying it as a reality. He spoke to the soldiers individually when he could, not with speeches, not with the rhetoric of commanders inspiring men to die well, but with the specific attention of a person who sees the individual in front of him rather than the role the individual occupies. He asked names. He remembered them. He asked about homes, about families, about what they were fighting for in the particular sense rather than the general one. This was Gandalf's method, actually, the attention to the small, the specific, the individual rather than the category. Aragorn had learned it from Gandalf over decades of watching him operate, watching him sit with farmers and hobbits and minor figures of no political consequence and give them the full weight of his attention. He had internalized it without knowing he was internalizing it, and now he deployed it without knowing it was a deployment. Legolas came to him before dark. "The Uruk-hai are a day away," he said. He had been counting them from the walls with elvish perception, which extended further than the Rohirrim's scouts and was more precise about what it saw. "How many?" Aragorn said. Legolas was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding whether to say a number. 10,000, he said. Aragorn looked at the walls, at the defenders on them, at the Hornburg behind them and the deepening wall beside them and the valley beyond that was going to channel 10,000 Uruk-hai toward 300 men like water through a narrowed pipe. Then we hold, he said. With what? Legolas said. Not despair, a genuine question, the elf's precise mind running the numbers and finding them insufficient and wanting to understand the strategy that made the insufficiency manageable. With what we have, Aragorn said. Which is the walls, and the men on them, and the night, and the hope that 10,000 Uruk-hai concentrated in a coombe is 10,000 targets. Legolas looked at him for a moment with the expression he sometimes wore, the expression that Aragorn interpreted as the elvish assessment of a human decision, the calculation of a mind that processed mortality differently, encountering a decision that only made sense from inside mortality. All right, Legolas said. Then we hold. The night was long. Nights at Helm's Deep were always long, but this one was the specific kind of long that has nothing to do with duration and everything to do with what fills it, the sound of 10,000 enemies approaching in the dark, the quality of noise that a force that size makes, the specific psychology of being inside walls while something that large moves toward you. They held. Not easily, not confidently, not in the way that stories remembered it. The stories simplified the night into a series of heroic moments, bright points against a dark background. And the truth was that the dark background was the majority of the experience and the bright points were what you held onto to get through the background rather than what the night fundamentally was. The deepening wall held until it did not hold. Saruman's fire, the one contribution of his war-making that had survived the fall of Isengard, packed into cylinders by hands that were no longer operative but had done their work before they stopped, went off beneath the culvert and the wall came apart and the Uruk-hai poured through and the battle became something more desperate than a defense, became the specific quality of combat that happens when the plan has failed and the only option is to not stop. Aragorn rode out at the Hornburg's gate at what felt like dawn but was still dark, rode out into the massive Uruk-hai with Theoden beside him and the Rohirrim behind them and the specific quality of a charge that is not a charge toward victory but a charge away from dying inside, the motion of people who have decided that dying in motion is preferable to dying in place. The light came. Not from the east, from the pass above the deep, from the road that descended into the coombe from the direction of Edoras. Light that was not the sun, or was the sun refracted through something? Through the specific quality of dawn hitting the white of a wizard's robes and the coats of horses that were coming down the pass at a speed that did not have a natural explanation. Saruman's white robes were on Saruman. But Saruman was not coming down the pass. What was coming down the pass was Erkenbrand of the Westfold with 2,000 Rohirrim cavalry, and behind them the vanguard of the Huorns that Treebeard had sent from Fangorn, the trees that had moved in the night across the plains of Rohan with the specific fury of ancient things that have finally decided to act. It was not the intervention they had hoped for. It was different, messier, less directed, more the consequence of multiple things moving simultaneously than the consequence of a plan. But it was the difference between being destroyed at dawn and surviving to fight the day. The Uruk-hai broke. Not from the cavalry alone, from the Huorns, who received the fleeing enemy into the forest that had appeared where no forest had been and did not release them in the way that forests generally do not release things that have entered them when the forest is angry. Aragorn stood in the wreckage of Helm's Deep at dawn and looked at what they had survived and understood that surviving it was not the same as winning it. They had held. They had held without the White Rider, without the dawn reinforcement that the original plan had built in as its final element, without the wizard who should have been there. They had held with Erkenbrand, who had gotten the message Aragorn sent before the battle and had ridden through the night to respond to it. With the Huorns, whose presence was Treebeard's decision and Merry and Pippin's doing and nobody's plan. With 10,000 Uruk-hai crowded into a coombe that turned their numbers into a liability rather than an asset. With the walls holding longer than they should have and the gate holding longer than was reasonable and the men on the walls being more stubborn than the arithmetic suggested they should have been able to be. They had held with what they had. And what they had been enough. Barely. But enough. He thought about Gandalf. Not with grief, not in this moment. Grief was something he could afford later, in the spaces between necessities, and there were no spaces between necessities yet. He thought about him with the specific quality of thinking that one develops about teachers after the teacher is gone and the teaching is all that remains, not nostalgic, but functional, the way you access a tool you can no longer repair, using what it built in you rather than the thing itself. Gandalf would have had a plan. Aragorn had had decisions. The difference between a plan and decisions is the difference between knowing where you are going and going somewhere. The destination is less certain in the second version and the going is not easier. But you can go. You can keep going. And the going, maintained long enough, produces outcomes that could not have been predicted at the outset. He looked at the changed landscape outside Helm's Deep, at the forest that had appeared in the night, at the dawnlight on the deeping combe, at the soldiers who were alive who might not have been. He looked at it for one moment, the specific moment that exists between the end of one thing and the beginning of the next, the moment that is available only briefly before it closes. Then he turned toward Isengard. Isengard fell in the night while Helm's Deep burned. The timing was Treebeard's, not coordinated with the battle, not planned to coincide with the Rohirrim's crisis, but coinciding anyway in the way that things coincide when multiple forces have been building toward the same moment and reach it by different routes. The Ents had walked into Isengard's valley and broken its walls and released the river into the pit and drowned the furnaces and the mechanisms and the decades of Saruman's careful accumulation in the water that Isengard had diverted for its own purposes and now received back at its own purposes' expense. Saruman stood at the top of Orthanc and watched. He had watched for 2 days before the Ents arrived. He had seen them coming. His intelligence was not Sauron's, not the comprehensive awareness that the eye provided, but it was sufficient to see the movement of large things across landscape he had been observing for decades. He had watched and he had made calculations about what they were doing and what it meant and had arrived, with the precision that had always characterized his thinking even when his thinking was in service of the wrong things, at an accurate assessment of his situation. He was finished. Isengard was going to fall. His army was at Helm's Deep and was not coming back. He had felt the moment the charges went off, had felt it in the way that powerful people feel the significant events connected to their work, and he had felt after it the silence that followed and had understood what the silence meant. His army was destroyed or would be destroyed. His fortress was about to become a lake. His position in the war was over. He sat with this on the top of Orthanc for 2 days while the Ents moved below him and the water rose and the furnaces went dark. He sat with it in the way that he had learned to sit with things in Fangorn after Isengard first fell, the specific discipline of a mind that has spent centuries in motion and is learning, against its nature, to be still. What he had done was wrong. He had known it was wrong in the full information sense, had been capable of the analysis that showed the error, had possessed all the components of the understanding that would have prevented it, and had arranged those components in a way that made the error feel like wisdom for long enough to act on it. This was the specific character of his failure, and he understood it precisely, with the precision of a man examining his own mistakes rather than explaining them. He was not certain what came after understanding. He was not certain that understanding was worth anything at this point, that the damage was undoable, that the years of misdirection had left anything to work with. He was not certain of much. What he was certain of was that Aragorn was coming. He had seen the battle at Helm's Deep from Orthanc's height, had watched the night's events with the clarity of someone with sufficient elevation and sufficient perception to read a battle in the dark. He had watched Aragorn ride out into the Uruk High. He had watched the Dawn Intervention, Erkenbrand, the Huorns, the specific surprise of forces arriving from unexpected directions. He thought, that was not a plan. That was a man making decisions until the decisions accumulated into something that worked. He thought about Gandalf. He thought about Gandalf the way he had been thinking about Gandalf since Fangorn, with the quality of a reckoning, an accounting, a measurement of 2 different approaches to the same problem and what each of them had produced. Gandalf had gone into Moria and fallen, and the company had survived anyway. He, Saruman, had spent decades building the most sophisticated military and industrial apparatus the Third Age had seen, and it was currently becoming a lake. He thought, I have been optimizing for the wrong variable. The thought had the quality of an insight that had cost too much to arrive at. When Aragorn came to Isengard, he found it flooded and Merry and Pippin sitting in the wreckage eating and Treebeard standing in the water with the satisfaction of something that has done what it came to do. He found all of this, and then he found Saruman at the base of Orthanc, which was not where he had expected to find him. Saruman had come down from the tower. This was significant, not tactically but psychologically, the act of a man choosing to be on the same level as the people who had come to deal with him rather than elevated above them. He stood in the shallow water outside Orthanc's base and he looked at Aragorn with the expression of a man who has decided to be honest and is finding honesty harder to maintain than he expected. You survived, Saruman said. Yes, Aragorn said. I watched. I saw. It should not have worked. The numbers were wrong. The numbers are always wrong, Aragorn said. You fight with what you have. Saruman looked at him. Then he looked at the flooded valley around them, at the wreckage of decades. What you have defeated mine, he said. It was not bitterness. It was assessment. Yes, Aragorn said. What do you do with me? Aragorn looked at him for a long time. He was thinking about what Gandalf would have done, which was an imperfect guide because Gandalf was dead and he was not Gandalf, but it was the best reference available. Gandalf would have been furious and would not have shown it. Gandalf would have said something that cut to the center of what Saruman was and what he had done and what was left. Gandalf would have found a plain version of it and said it in a way that was memorable. Aragorn was not capable of that particular thing. He said what he was able to say, which was plain in a different register. "What is left of you that is worth saving?" he said. Saruman was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said. "That is the honest answer." "Then find out," Aragorn said. "There is work to do and people are going to die and I do not have the luxury of deciding what to do with a wizard who might be useful. If you are going to be useful, be useful. If you are not, stay out of the way." It was not forgiveness. It was not justice. It was the pragmatism of a man in the middle of a war who did not have time for either and was choosing the thing that the moment required instead of the thing that the situation deserved. Saruman looked at him. Something moved through his expression, not relief, not gratitude, something more complicated than either. The look of a man who has been given something he is not certain he has earned and is deciding whether to take it. He took it. What followed in the days between Helm's Deep and the siege of Minas Tirith was not a redemption. That word implies something cleaner than what actually happened, a return to a recognizable state, reversal of damage, a restoration of what had been. What actually happened was messier and smaller and more uncertain than redemption, a man who had spent decades becoming the wrong version of himself, working alongside people who had no particular reason to trust him and were trusting him anyway because the situation required it, doing useful things not because the doing erased the previous not doing but because useful things needed to be done and he was capable of doing them. He knew things that were useful. He knew Sauron's methods, not from inside knowledge, not from the Palantir communication that had ended when he broke from Sauron, but from centuries of studying the same texts, the same histories, the same theoretical frameworks. He knew where the armies would move and why. He knew the Nazgul's operational patterns and the specific vulnerabilities of forces that depended on terror as a primary weapon, that terror worked most effectively on isolated targets and lost effectiveness against forces that maintained formation and cohesion. He knew Mordor's timing, which was determined by Sauron's psychology as much as military calculation, by the specific impatience of something that had been denied its primary instrument and was moving faster than optimal to compensate. He told Aragorn all of this. He told it without managing the telling, without shaping it toward conclusions he preferred, without the subtle adjustments that had characterized everything he said in the years when his primary audience was himself and his primary purpose was self-justification. He simply told what he knew. Aragorn listened. He did not always use what he heard, but he listened. The war moved toward Gondor. Denethor held Minas Tirith in the way that great men hold things when they have stopped believing in the holding, with complete competence and complete despair simultaneously, the specific combination that produces decisions that are technically correct and strategically catastrophic. He was brilliant and he was broken, and the breakage had the particular quality of a mind that has looked into the Palantir and seen what Sauron wanted him to see, the selective truth that was more demoralizing than outright falsehood because it could not be dismissed as simply wrong. Faramir came back from Ithilien with the news about Frodo. He had let the Ringbearer go, had let him go toward Mordor with a guide he did not trust and a mission he did not know how to help, and the specific courage of someone who has done everything he can do and is accepting the limits of what he can do without letting the acceptance become defeat. Denethor received this news in the way he received most news in those days, as confirmation of the disaster he had already concluded was coming. He sent Faramir back out immediately, back to the line, back to the position that needed holding even though it could not hold, in the way of a man who is distributing his pieces in a game he believes is already lost. Pippin was there. This was the strangeness that no account of Minas Tirith in the war ever fully captured, the presence of a hobbit from the Shire in the court of the stewards of Gondor, this small creature who had no business being there and was there anyway, who had pledged his service to Denethor in the way that hobbits sometimes did things, impulsively and completely, with the specific sincerity of a people who did not distinguish between the large and small versions of commitment. Pippin watched Denethor. He watched him with the attention that small creatures develop when they are in the presence of large powers, the specific alertness of someone who cannot afford to miss anything because missing things is more expensive for them than for others. He watched and he understood, with the hobbit intelligence that operated below the level of strategic analysis and above the level of pure intuition, that something in Denethor was not surviving this war. He sent the signal. The beacon on Amon Din, which should have been lit by order and was lit instead by a hobbit from the Shire who had decided that waiting for the order was not survivable, who had climbed to the beacon in the dark with the specific determination of someone who has stopped waiting for permission. The beacon spread across the White Mountains toward Rohan. Theoden saw them. He had been preparing. In the days since the recovery at Meduseld, the incomplete recovery, the return of enough of himself to function as a king even if not all of what had been lost had returned, he had been preparing with the efficiency of a soldier who understands what preparation requires and is not willing to do less than it requires. The muster of Rohan assembled with a speed that the situation demanded and a completeness that surprised those who had been watching Rohan's decline and had underestimated what Rohan could produce when it was being itself. Eowyn came to Aragorn. She came to him in the night before the Rohirrim rode, while the camp was doing the last things that camps do before movements that might be final, and she came with the specific directness of someone who has decided that the time for indirection is over and the cost of directness is acceptable. She said, "Take me with you." He looked at her. He had known her in the weeks since Helm's Deep, had watched her during Theoden's recovery and the preparations for the ride with the attention that he paid to people who interested him, which was the same attention he paid to everyone but with an additional quality when the person was doing something that required watching carefully to understand. He had watched her be competent and contained and furious in the specific way of someone whose competence exceeds the scope they are permitted and who has spent years living inside that disproportion. He said, "You are needed here." She said, "I am needed where I can be of use." He looked at her for a long time. He was thinking about her uncle, about what Theoden was about to ride toward and whether he was riding toward it because of the war's needs or because of the specific quality of a man who has recovered enough of himself to want to spend what remains of that self in a direction that matters. He was thinking about what Gondor needed from Rohan, which was the Rohirrim and their cavalry and not a war about who was permitted to come. He said, "The city will need defenders." She said, "There are defenders." He said, "Theoden." She said, "Theoden is riding to his death and he knows it and I know it and you know it, and I am asking you to let me be present for it rather than absent from it, which is all I am asking." He was quiet for a long time. He was thinking about Gandalf. About what Gandalf would have said, what Gandalf would have known, whether Gandalf's knowledge of how the story went included knowledge of what Eowyn was going to do regardless of what Aragorn decided, whether this was a conversation that changed an outcome or a conversation that was adjacent to an outcome already fixed. He did not know. He was not Gandalf. He did not have the knowledge of trajectories that Gandalf had carried, the understanding of the story's shape from somewhere above the level of individual decisions. He said, "I cannot stop you." She heard this correctly, not as permission, not as endorsement, but as the only honest thing available to say. She nodded once. She left. He stood in the camp and thought about what he had just not done and whether not doing it was the right decision and concluded that the question was unanswerable with the information available and moved on to the next thing that required attention. The Rohirrim rode at dawn. The ride to Minas Tirith was the ride that songs remembered and the songs were accurate about the speed and the quality of it, the Rohirrim riding in the dark, the pace of cavalry that had been bred for exactly this, the specific sound of a large mounted force moving through landscape at full commitment. Aragorn was not among them. He had gone south with the Grey Company on a path that required a different kind of movement, through the paths of the dead. The paths of the dead. This requires saying directly, Aragorn walked into the mountain knowing what he was walking into. He walked in knowing the history, that the dead men of Dunharrow had pledged their service to Isildur's line and forsworn it and been cursed to remain in the mountain until the oath was fulfilled, which required a descendant of Isildur to call them. He knew this. He had known it since childhood, had been told it by Elrond in the specific way that Elrond told him things that were both his birthright and his burden. He walked in anyway. Not because he was certain it would work, it was the kind of thing that could not be certain in advance, that depended on something he could not fully verify, namely whether what he was sufficient to be what the oath required. He walked in because the calculation of what happened without the dead men's service produced an outcome that made the risk of the paths worthwhile. The dead were there. They were always there, they had been there since the Third Age began, waiting in the specific way of the oath-bound, not patient exactly because patience implies the passage of time in a comfortable direction, and what the dead experienced was something more like suspension, like a moment extended past all natural duration, waiting for the thing that would end it. He called them. He called them in the voice of someone who had spent his life knowing he was the last of his line and finding this fact uncomfortable and had arrived at the moment when the fact was required and found, to his own surprise, that it was available, that the voice was there, that the authority was there, that the 87 years of preparation had built something that could do this thing. They came. The army of the dead, the Oathbreakers, The men who had said they would and had not and had been waiting since before the War of the Ring began to finally do the thing they had failed to do. They came out of the mountain and into the night with the quality of something long compressed finally released. They swept down the rivers. They came to the port cities of Gondor's coastline that Sauron's corsairs had been holding, that were supposed to be part of the trap, the navy that would prevent any reinforcement reaching Minas Tirith by sea, the closure of the southern approach, the completion of the encirclement. They swept through the corsairs with the specific efficiency of the dead dealing with the living, which has nothing to do with strength and everything to do with the quality of terror that only things that have already died can generate. Aragorn released them. He stood on the shore of the river with the dead gathered around him, and he released them from the oath, spoke the words that ended the suspension, gave them what they had been waiting for in the mountain since before he was born. They dissolved. They did not go anywhere recognizable, they simply stopped being present in the visible world, returned to whatever state the dead return to when the thing they were waiting for has been done. He stood on the shore after they were gone and felt the specific quality of an absence that was also a completion, the silence of something finished. He took the ships. He took the Corsair fleet, loaded it with the men of southern Gondor who had been fighting in the south and had seen the dead's work and had the specific energy of soldiers who have witnessed the impossible and concluded from this that the impossible is possible, which is one of the most motivating realizations available to armies in desperate situations. He came up the Anduin. He came to Minas Tirith in the hour that was beyond hours, in the moment after the moment when the battle had been decided in every direction except the direction it had actually been decided. On the Pelennor fields, Theoden had died. He had died as he had ridden, entirely himself, in the direction that mattered, at the cost that it cost, with the specific dignity of a man who had recovered himself in time to spend what remained. The Witch King had come for him and had found Eowyn between them, and what had followed was the thing that Sauron's intelligence had not accounted for, the gap in his comprehensive knowledge of who could oppose the Lord of the Nazgul, not a man, the prophecy said. And the prophecy was right, and Eowyn was not a man, and Merry was not a man in the sense the prophecy meant, and between them they had done the thing that the prophecy had said could not be done. Aragorn came onto the Pelennor in the dawn and the battle turned. Not because of him alone, the Rohirrim had turned it already, had made the impossible charge at the Arlafonts and the Haradrim and the massed weight of Mordor's armies and had turned it with the specific fury of a people fighting for their king. But the ships were the completion of what the cavalry had begun, the arrival of forces from the direction no one expected, the simple arithmetic of soldiers who had been fighting all night looking at ships coming up the river and understanding that the ships were on their side. He fought through the morning. He fought with the quality he had always brought to fighting, present, precise, without the performance of heroism, the simple effectiveness of someone who had been trained for this for 87 years and whose training had, in its way, been sufficient. Beside him Legolas and Gimli fought with the specific companionship that had been building since Moria, the two of them developing in the course of a war of friendship that was going to be remembered long after the war, that the world was going to consider one of the notable facts about this age regardless of what else happened. The sun rose fully over the Pelennor and the battle was won and the field was covered with the cost of winning it, and Aragorn stood in the aftermath and looked at what they had survived. He looked for Eowyn. He found her on the field, wounded, alive. He healed her with the hands of a king. This was the first time the healing had been available to him in its full form, the first time he had been in a position to use it openly, without concealment, as what it was, the king's touch, the specific power that ran in the line of Elendil and had been present in him his entire life and had been the most heavily concealed of all his concealments. He laid his hands on her and he healed her, and he felt, in the doing of it, the specific quality of becoming what he had always been, not achieving something new but arriving at something that had been waiting. He healed others. He healed Faramir, who had been brought back from the brink of something that was not quite death but was adjacent to it, the specific damage of the black breath that the Nazgul left behind them. He healed Merry, who had been wounded by the same darkness. He moved through the houses of healing doing what kings of his line did when they did what they were made to do. Gandalf would have been here. This was the thought he kept having, not as grief, not in this moment, but as a simple observation, an awareness of the shape of what was absent. Gandalf would have been in this city before the siege. He would have held the Nether together, or would have tried, and the trying might have been sufficient. He would have been at the gate when the Witch King came, would have faced him with the authority of someone whose nature the Witch King would have recognized as something other than mortal. He was not here. The gate had held without him. The Witch King had been dealt with without him. The battle had been won without him. Every time Aragorn turned around in this war and found something that should not have worked working, he thought about what Gandalf had said in Moria, not the famous thing, but the quiet thing, the instruction that had only become audible in retrospect. The question was never whether you were ready. The question was whether you would go anyway. They had gone anyway. All of them, Aragorn making decisions without the information the decisions required, Theoden recovering himself in time to spend what remained, Eowyn being where the prophecy said no one of her kind should be, Merry striking the blow that made the impossible blow possible, Faramir letting Frodo go toward a mountain where Faramir could not follow, Sam wading into a river after a departing boat. They had gone anyway. And the going had been enough. Not comfortable, not without cost, not the version of enough that songs preferred. But enough. He stood in Minas Tirith and thought, now we wait. Because that was what came next. Not rest. Rest was not available. The war was not over. The question of what happened in Mordor was not resolved. The matter of the ring was still open, still pending, still the thing that everything else had been in service of and toward which everything else was still oriented. He had fought the war in the West with what he had, and the war in the West was going as well as could be hoped. The war in Mordor was Frodo's. He waited. He planned the next move, the feint, the army he would take to the Black Gate to draw Sauron's eye, to create enough distraction and enough pressure to give the ring-bearer whatever time remained. He planned it with Saruman's help, which was strange and was useful, and was the kind of usefulness that he had stopped being surprised by, the competence that remained when everything else was stripped away. Saruman, in those days of planning, was the most purely useful he had ever been. Without the project of Isengard, without the decades of accumulation and building and the elaborate self-justification that had surrounded it, he was a mind of extraordinary precision and range applied without agenda to the problems in front of it. He was still Saruman, still capable of the specific irritation of someone who is right and knows it and finds it useful to know it, but the irritation was small and the precision was large, and the problems needed the precision more than they needed him to be comfortable. He told Aragorn things about Mordor's disposition that Aragorn could not have known otherwise. He told him about the concentration of forces at the Morannon, about the specific vulnerability of an army that had been organized around a central will and had not developed the distributed command structures that allowed forces to act independently when the central will was disrupted. He told him that Sauron's army was vast and would remain vast right up until the moment it stopped being anything at all, and that the transition between those two states would be fast and would be complete and would require the person standing outside the gate at the moment it happened to be standing somewhere they could survive what followed. Be somewhere you can survive it, Saruman said. That is your military advice, Aragorn said. That is my specific advice for this specific situation, Saruman said. The broader advice is, put your best soldiers at the front and your most reliable officers in command of the flanks, and do not let the army know how small it is relative to what it's facing. They will find out eventually, and by then it will be too late to make a different decision. They already know how small it is, Aragorn said. Yes, Saruman said. Which is why they are going anyway. Which is, he paused. I have been thinking about that. The going anyway. I spent decades not going anywhere because going required certainty I did not have. I waited for certainty and built certainty, and when the certainty was insufficient I built more. And the building consumed everything I was building it to protect. He looked at Aragorn. You do not seem to wait for certainty. There is no certainty to wait for, Aragorn said. No, Saruman said. There isn't. I understand that now. I understood it academically for centuries and I understand it differently now. He paused. Gandalf understood it from the beginning. It was, I think, the thing I most resented about him. The army went to the Black Gate. They went with full knowledge of what they were going to, the gate itself, the assembled might of Mordor, the eye of Sauron directed at them with the specific intensity of something that had been provoked into turning, that was being asked to look at the people outside its gate instead of at the mountain in its interior. They went with Aragorn at the front and Saruman at his right hand, which was strange enough that the soldiers who knew Saruman's history kept looking at the placement and recalculating it and arriving at the same conclusion. Yes, he is there, and yes, Aragorn put him there, and yes, this is the situation. They stood at the gate and Aragorn spoke. He spoke not with the rhetoric of a general preparing soldiers for battle, but with the plainness of a man saying something true in a situation that required truth rather than inspiration. He said, "We may die here." He said, "Dying here is not the same as dying for nothing." He said, "The reason we came here is not to win this battle, which we cannot win, but to make it possible for someone else to win a different battle, which is the only battle that matters." He said, "The ring-bearer is in Mordor. We are here so that Sauron looks at us instead of at the ring-bearer." He said, "This is enough. This is what we can do. This is what we came to do." The gate opened. What came out was the assembled power of Mordor as it existed in the final days of the Third Age, not Sauron's full power, which had never been recovered after the ring's departure from his hand in the Second Age. but his current power, everything he had rebuilt and gathered and organized over 3,000 years of patient accumulation. It came out with the quality of something that has been waiting to be used and has been given permission. Aragorn stood in front of it. He stood with the army of the west at his back and Saruman beside him and the eagles overhead, the eagles, who came because Gwaihir and his kind had their own reasons for being present at the ending of an age, had always had their own reasons, had never been simply instruments of other beings' plans but had moved in accordance with their own understanding of what the moment required. He stood and he waited. Not for rescue. Not for the cavalry over the hill, the dawn reinforcement, the external intervention that changed the arithmetic. He waited because waiting was what the plan required, because every moment that Sauron's eye was directed outward was a moment it was not directed inward, toward the mountain, toward the small figures moving through Mordor's interior with the last of what they had left. He waited. The army waited. The gate's forces arrayed themselves with the organized efficiency of an army that has absolute confidence in its numerical advantage, and the absolute confidence was accurate, and it did not matter. In Mordor, on the slopes of a mountain, a hobbit was deciding. Frodo stood at the cracks of doom with Sam behind him and Gollum somewhere in the shadows and the ring in his hand and the fire below. He had been walking toward this moment since Bag End, since the evening when Gandalf had put the ring on the table in the firelight and the world had become what the world had been ever since. He had walked toward it through Moria and through Lothlórien and through the breaking of the Fellowship and through the long months in the wilderness with a guide he did not entirely trust and a companion he trusted completely. He stood at the edge and he felt the ring respond to its home, not pulling him toward the fire, never toward the fire, always away from the fire, always toward the finger, always toward the wearing, always toward the becoming that it had been offering since the beginning. He felt it with complete clarity because they were here, because there was no distance left between the offering and the completion of the offering, and clarity was what proximity produced. He thought about Gandalf. Not as instruction. Gandalf had not told him what to do here. No one had told him what to do here. This was the thing that no one could tell him because it was the thing that could only be done or not done rather than advised or prepared for or made easier by the right words at the right time. He thought about Gandalf as presence, the presence that had been absent since Moria, that he had been moving without since the Fellowship broke, that had made the moving feel like moving without a flaw for months. He thought about what the presence had made possible and what its absence had required. He thought about Lothlórien and Galadriel and the file in his pack. He thought about Faramir, who had let him go. He thought about Sam, who had waded into the river after the departing boat and had been wading after him ever since, through every dark place, with the specific stubbornness of someone who has made a decision so fundamental it doesn't wear out. He thought, I have been doing this without Gandalf since Moria. I can do this without Gandalf here. The thought was simple. The simplicity of it was what made it possible, not heroic, not the culmination of a long narrative arc, not the climactic moment of a person becoming what they were always meant to become. Just a simple thought. I can do this. Not because I am sufficient, but because this is what there is to do and I am the one here to do it. He threw the ring. Not quickly. He stood with it for a moment that was long enough to be a decision rather than a reflex, long enough for the ring to make its final offering in the full precision of its proximity to home, long enough for Frodo to feel the complete weight of what was being offered and what was being refused. And then he threw it. Not because the refusing was easy. Not because the weight had been lifted or the offering had been declined. Because the refusing was possible and the refusing was right and the right thing being possible was enough. The ring went into the fire. Gollum came from the shadows. He came because the ring was gone, because the thing that had organized his existence for 500 years was ending, because he could not stop himself from going after it any more than he could have stopped breathing. The motion was not choice, was below choice, was the expression of something so deep it had replaced the person who might have chosen. He went into the fire after the ring and the fire received him and the argument between Smeagol and the other thing that had been going on for 500 years resolved itself in the only way it was ever going to resolve. The sound. The frequency. The chord unmade. On the Pelennor, in the army before the Black Gate, Aragorn felt it before he heard it, felt it the way powerful things are felt rather than perceived, a change in the quality of the world, a note resolving, a chord that had been held for 3,000 years releasing. The armies of Mordor stopped. Not gradually. Not the slow dissolution that people had imagined, the individual soldiers losing coordination and purpose over time as the organizing intelligence weakened. The stopping was comprehensive, 1,000 things all ceasing simultaneously, as if a switch had been thrown, as if the thing that had been making them move had simply stopped making them move. The eye went out. Not figuratively, The specific quality of directed malevolent intelligence that had been turned outward toward the gate simply ceased. In Mordor the structures began to fail, not because they were attacked but because what had been maintaining them, the specific will that had built them and sustained them, was no longer maintaining anything. The mountain erupted. The sky changed. The quality of the light over Mordor was different in a way that no one standing in it could fully articulate, not brighter, not darker, but different, the way air is different after a long storm passes, the specific quality of something that has been present and is no longer present, and the absence changes the texture of everything around it. Aragorn stood at the gate and watched the armies of Mordor lose their coherence and felt the magnitude of what had just happened. Not triumph, not yet, the feeling was too large for triumph and too complicated for simple relief. It was closer to the feeling of hearing a word you have been trying to remember for a very long time and finally, unexpectedly, hearing it. Recognition. Completion. The sense of a thing closed. He thought about Frodo. He thought about a hobbit from the Shire who had carried the most dangerous object in the world to the place where it could be destroyed and had thrown it in, and who had done this without Gandalf, who had done it with what he had, which had turned out to be enough. He thought, Gandalf knew. He did not know what Frodo would face, and he did not know what I would face, and he did not know how any of this would go. But he knew something about what small things are capable of when large things trust them with large tasks. He knew something about the going anyway. He had tried to teach it. He had spent 2,000 years in Middle-earth teaching it in the only way it can be taught, which is not by instruction but by example, by being the person who went anyway, who showed up, who cared about the small things, who took the hobbits seriously, who stopped to have tea with Bilbo Baggins and to notice that Bilbo's nephew was capable of something that the world was going to need. He had taught it, and then he had died in Moria and left them to go anyway without him. They had. And here they were. Saruman was beside him when the armies of Mordor collapsed. He watched the collapse with the expression of someone who has spent 3 centuries building systems to address a problem and has just seen the problem addressed by a mechanism his systems never accounted for. The expression had multiple layers. There was the layer of a man watching something he had wrongly dismissed as insufficient proving itself sufficient, and under that the layer of a man reckoning with what the insufficiency he had wrongly attributed said about him, and under that something quieter and less complicated, something that was just watching something extraordinary happen and recognizing it as extraordinary. He said, "A hobbit." "Yes," Aragorn said. "From the Shire." "Yes." Saruman was quiet for a long time. "Gandalf knew," he said finally. "He always knew. I thought it was sentiment. His fondness for the small people, his visits to the Shire, the time he spent with them, I thought it was the indulgence of a mind that was not as rigorous as it should have been. I thought he was wasting time." He paused. He was doing the most important thing that was done in this age, and he was doing it by having tea and smoking pipeweed and noticing which hobbit had something worth noticing. "Yes," Aragorn said. "I should have paid more attention to what he was paying attention to," Saruman said. "Yes," Aragorn said. They stood together in the aftermath of the gate, in the wreckage of Mordor's last organized effort, and Saruman said nothing else for a long time, and Aragorn did not require him to. There was nothing to add. The statement was complete, and the completion did not require embellishment. The eagles came down. They came for Frodo and Sam, who were on the slopes of the mountain in the place that the mountain's eruption was going to consume, in the specific situation of people who have done what they came to do and have no path back from the doing. The eagles came because Gwaihir owed Gandalf a debt and had transferred the debt to Gandalf's purpose, because the great birds had their own relationship with the age and its ending, because some things happen not because someone planned them but because they were going to happen and the planning would not have made them happen differently. They brought them out. They brought them to the fields of Cormorant and to rest, and to the specific quality of waking up in a place that is safe after a long time of nothing being safe, the specific disorientation of safety when you have been calibrated to danger. The slow process of a body and mind understanding that the thing they have been braced against is no longer coming. Frodo woke to Gandalf. He woke to a laugh and to the grey pilgrim's face, and felt the specific quality of something that had been absent returning, not the return of a ghost, not a vision, but Gandalf, present, in the room, as real as the sunlight coming through the window and the smell of food somewhere nearby. Gandalf restored, Gandalf returned, Gandalf sent back by powers whose workings were not fully legible to mortal or even most immortal minds, returned because the task he had been sent for was not yet complete, and because there were things that needed to be said that he had not said yet. He looked at Frodo with the expression of a man who has been in a place that does not translate into language and has come back to a person he is very glad to see. He said, "You did it." Frodo looked at him. He was still processing the fact of the presence, the reality of Gandalf in the room, which should not have been possible and was. He said, "You died." "Yes," Gandalf said. "And then I did not." These things happen in ways that are difficult to explain and not entirely necessary to explain. He sat down beside Frodo with the ease of a man settling into a familiar chair. "You went without me." "Yes. And you succeeded." "We succeeded," Frodo said. "Sam." "I know about Sam," Gandalf said. The way he said it communicated the full weight of knowing, not just the information but the understanding of what Sam had done and what it had cost and what it was worth and the specific quality of loyalty that could produce it. "I know about all of you. I have been watching from somewhere with a view. And the view was," he paused. "It was the most extraordinary thing I have watched in 2,000 years in this world. And I have watched extraordinary things." Frodo looked at him. "You would have made it easier," he said. "Not as accusation. As fact." "Perhaps," Gandalf said. "Or perhaps I would have made different decisions that produced different problems. Perhaps the thing you found in Moria, the necessity, the going anyway, perhaps that was not possible with me present. Perhaps my presence would have been a kind of safety that made the other kind of safety unreachable." He paused. "I do not know. I have been thinking about it and I do not know. What I know is what happened, which is that you went anyway and you reached the fire and you threw it in. And the world is different because of it. That is what I know." Frodo was quiet. "I stood there for a long time," he said. "At the edge." "I know," Gandalf said. "I almost didn't." "I know," Gandalf said. "Almost is not didn't. The distance between almost and didn't is the entire Third Age of Middle-earth. It is the most important distance in the history of this world and it was covered by a hobbit from the Shire with insufficient information and no guarantee of success, and I could not be more." He stopped. He looked at Frodo with an expression that was not easily categorized, that occupied territory between pride and grief and gratitude and the specific quality of an old mind confronting something that exceeded its categories. "I could not be more anything. The word does not exist." They sat together in the room in Cormallen and outside the eagles were on the ground and the army of the west was recovering itself and somewhere in the city being prepared for a king who was coming home. Minas Tirith was doing the thing that surviving cities do, which is continuing. Sam came in eventually. He came in with the specific combination of relief and embarrassment that characterized Sam in moments of emotional weight, the relief that the wait was over, the embarrassment at having feelings this large in front of people. He looked at Gandalf with the expression of a man who has been told something was impossible and is deciding how to feel about it being possible. "Mr. Gandalf," he said. You came back." "Yes," Gandalf said. "We could have used you," Sam said. Not unkindly. Simply as a fact, in the way that Sam stated facts, as if facts did not require apology for being what they were. "I know," Gandalf said. "I am sorry for the timing." "Can't be helped, I suppose," Sam said, with the tone of a gardener accepting weather. "Things went all right in the end." "They did," Gandalf said. "In very large part because of you." Sam looked uncomfortable with this. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I just didn't leave." "Yes," Gandalf said. "That is the thing you did." He looked at Sam with the fullness of attention that he had always brought to hobbits, the specific quality of seeing what was there rather than what you expected to find when you looked at someone from the Shire. Not leaving, when leaving was possible and everything argued for it, is the most important thing anyone did in the war. "I have been thinking about this from my view and this is my conclusion." Sam thought about this for a moment. "I promised," he said. "I know," Gandalf said. "I know you did." The world continued outside. It continued in all the ways that worlds continue after the thing that has been threatening to end them stops threatening, not smoothly, not without difficulty, not in the clean resolution that the ending of the threat seemed to promise. The armies went home, the ones that had homes to go to and the ones that were going to have to build them. Gondor began the process of becoming a kingdom rather than a stewardship. Rohan buried its king with the specific ceremony of a people that understood ceremony as a form of memory, that believed the proper marking of loss was how you kept the lost person with you. Aragorn came to Minas Tirith and was crowned. He was crowned in the way he had always known he would be crowned if it happened, without the dramatic transformation, without the sense of becoming something new. He was who he was and the crown was a fact about that, an acknowledgement rather than a creation. He was Elessar, king of the reunited kingdom, and the name was one he had been given long ago by a woman who had seen something in him before he fully saw it himself and had given him a name that was an instruction rather than a description. Arwen came from Rivendell. She came through Rohan and through Gondor's northern provinces with the quality of someone who has made a decision that is irrevocable and is walking toward it with both eyes open, knowing what it costs and choosing the cost. She came and she was who she was, the daughter of Elrond, the granddaughter of Galadriel, the descendant of every convergence of the First Age, and she chose to be here instead. She chose mortality. She chose the specific gift that her ancestor Lothlórien had chosen, the gift that was also a limitation, the voluntary acceptance of an ending in exchange for the specific kind of presence that only mortality makes possible. She chose Aragorn, who was going to die, and she chose to die with him, which was the most radical thing available to her and the thing she had known she was going to choose since she was young enough to understand what choosing meant. Elrond came. He came to give her away, which is what fathers do, which was an entirely inadequate description of what he was doing, which was releasing his daughter into a life he could not follow her into and a death that was going to come for her the way it came for everything mortal, and doing this with the fullness of the love that had been present since she was born and was not going to stop being present because she was making a choice he would not have made. He looked at Aragorn and said what he said, and what he said was in private and is not recorded. What is known is that he said it and that Aragorn received it and that whatever passed between them at that moment had the quality of a closing, the closing of a very long parenthesis that had opened when Elrond had taken in a 2-year-old child who was the last of his line, and had raised him, and had sent him out into the wilderness to become what he needed to become, and had now given him his daughter, which was the completion of an investment that had begun before the investment knew it was an investment. Gandalf was there. He was there in the way he was present for all of the significant things in this period. Not directing, not orchestrating, not the author of the moment but a witness to it, fully present, bringing to it the specific quality of attention that had always been his most consistent gift. He watched Aragorn crowned and watched Arwen arrive and watched Elrond's face and felt, in all of it, the weight of what had been survived and what had been lost and what was still, improbably and necessarily, present. The ring was gone. The Third Age was ending. The elves were going to leave, not all at once, not suddenly, but in the steady direction that departures take when a people has decided that departure is what the age requires of them. Galadriel would go. Elrond would go. Gandalf would go. He had known this since Moria, had understood it in the specific way of knowing something before you know it, that the return was not permanent, that the task had been completed and the completion meant the end of this particular chapter of his presence in the world. He sat with Frodo the night before the departure for the Grey Havens. They sat in the garden of Minas Tirith, which was not the Shire, which was never going to be the Shire, but which had in it something of the quality of a garden, something that Sam had put there in the week since the coronation, some principle of care expressed in soil and growing things, and they sat without talking for a while in the way of two people who have been through enough together to not require talk for presence. Then Gandalf said, "You should come with us." Frodo looked at him. He had known this was coming, had known it since the Shire, since the moment he had come back to Bag End and found that coming back had not produced the return he had expected, that the person who had left was not entirely the person who arrived. The wound was there, not visible, not something he talked about, but present in the quality of his days, in the specific texture of experience that had changed in the carrying and had not fully changed back. He said, yes. Not with grief. Not with the dramatic weight of an irrevocable choice. Simply yes, the yes of someone who has understood what they need and is not going to pretend otherwise for the comfort of a story that required him to stay. He needed what the Undying Lands offered and he was going to go, and this was the right decision, and it was a sad decision, and both of those things were true simultaneously without either cancelling the other. Sam was harder. Sam was the hardest thing. Sam, who had not left him from the Shire to the fire and back, who had been the thing that made not being alone true, who had waded into the river and carried him up the mountain. Sam was going to stay. Sam had Rosie. Sam had the garden he had planted and the Shire he had helped restore and the life that was waiting for him to come back and inhabit it. Sam was going to stay and grow old and die in the Shire among people he loved, and that was the right future for Sam, and Frodo knew this completely, and the knowing did not make the parting easier. He said goodbye to Sam at the Grey Havens in the way that things are said when they are final and both people know they are final, with the completeness that makes the saying itself the thing, not a preliminary to something else. He said what he said and Sam heard it, and they stood together at the pier for a moment that was the last moment and then was over. Frodo went onto the ship. The ship was already carrying Galadriel and Elrond and Gandalf, the three great minds of the Third Age, departing together, leaving the world to what it was going to be without them. Frodo joined them and the ship left the pier, and the Grey Havens grew small in the distance and the sea grew large ahead. He stood at the bow and watched the west become closer and felt, for the first time in years, the specific quality of moving towards something rather than moving through something. Not relief, it was more complicated than relief, but a direction that was finally towards something he needed rather than through something the world required. Behind him, on the pier at the Grey Havens, Sam stood until the ship was gone. He stood until there was nothing to see and kept standing for a while after that, in the way of someone who is taking a last thing seriously enough to stand in it fully before turning away from it. Then he turned. The road ran east toward the Shire, toward Rosie, toward the garden he had planted with the Malorn nut from Galadriel's hand, toward the life that was his and that he had been holding in trust for himself through all of it. He walked. He walked with the specific quality of a gardener walking toward a garden, purposeful, attentive, already thinking about what needed to be done when he got there, about the season and the soil and the things that would be growing and the things that needed tending. He walked in the early evening light of a world that was different than it had been and was still, stubbornly and completely, the world. The Shire was ahead. Home was ahead. He walked toward it with everything he had survived behind him, not as weight but as what it was, the past, completed, real, the ground on which the present stood and the future would stand, the thing that had happened and could not unhappen and did not need to. He was Sam Gamgee of Hobbiton. He had carried his master to the fire and back. He had kept his promise. He had not left. He walked home. Behind him the sea was the sea. Ahead of him the Shire was the Shire. The evening was an evening in the Shire and the light it made was the light the Shire made in the evening, and it was ordinary in the specific way that ordinary is most fully itself when you have been somewhere extraordinary long enough to understand what ordinary is worth. He walked into it. He did not look back. The Third Age ended not in a single moment but in the accumulation of departures, each ship from the Grey Havens, each elf who chose the sea over the shore, each member of the generation that had carried the war and was now handing the world to the generation that would carry the peace. The Fourth Age was the age of men, which meant it was the age of people who were going to make all the mistakes that people make and were going to have to solve them themselves, without the interventions of the divine or the semi-divine, without Istari or elvish counsel or the specific quality of guidance that older and deeper things had provided for as long as anyone could remember. Aragorn ruled for 120 years. He ruled well, not perfectly, not without error, but with the quality that came from 87 years of preparation and 30 more of understanding what the preparation had been for. He rebuilt the alliance between Gondor and Orna. He extended the peace into lands that had been outside the peace. He walked the line between king and man in the specific way that the best kings walk it, being both and letting each one inform the other. He died when he was ready to die, which is a form of grace available only to those with Numenorean blood in sufficient concentration, the choice of the departure at the right time. He lay down in the house of the kings and Arwen sat with him and he said what he said to her and she received it and he went. Arwen lived after him for a year. She lived in Lothlórien, which was empty now, the golden wood without its keeper, the Malorn trees still golden in autumn but with a different quality of gold, not maintained, not the product of a 3,000-year sustained act of will, but natural, which was its own kind of beauty and was not Galadriel's beauty. She lived there for a year and then she died, as she had chosen, in the autumn, under a tree that still had its leaves. The Shire went on. This is perhaps the most important part of the accounting. The Shire went on in the way that the Shire always went on, with the specific obliviousness of a people who had built their civilization around the principle that the world beyond their borders was none of their business and had managed, by this principle consistently applied, to survive everything the world beyond their borders had thrown at them. The Shire went on and the hobbits went on and the second and third and fourth generations after the War of the Ring knew about it the way that people know about history, as a fact about the past that was interesting and did not fully connect to the present. Except in one garden. In one garden in Hobbiton, under a Malorn tree that should not have been in the Shire and that was the only Malorn tree west of the Misty Mountains and had been planted by hands that had learned what they knew in the service of someone who needed to get home. The thing that Galadriel had given Sam Gamgee grew and continued to grow for as long as anyone in the Shire could remember. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary tree. Visitors came from outside the Shire to see it, which was remarkable because visitors from outside the Shire were not generally welcome and the welcome that was extended to them was provisional at best. But they came, and they looked at the tree, and they went home with the specific quality of having seen something that they did not fully have words for. The tree grew because someone had planted it with the attention of someone who cared about what grew in the place where they planted. Because someone had come back from the fire and the mountain and the long road through every dark place and had put a nut in the ground and said, "Here. This is what I am. This is what I came back for." The world turned. The tree grew. The Shire went on. And in the west, in whatever the undying lands were and whatever they offered to those who arrived there from the diminished shores of a world that had been through what Middle-earth had been through, a hobbit who had carried an impossible thing to an impossible place looked out at a sea that was a different kind of sea than any sea he had known and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific quality of being somewhere he was supposed to be. He was home. Not the Shire. He had said goodbye to the Shire when he got on the ship, had given it to Sam, had released it to the life that Sam was going to make in it. This was a different home, the home that waited on the other side of the sailing, the home that the wound in him had been pointing toward since Mordor, the place that Galadriel had offered him and that he had been walking toward ever since. He was there. The wound was healing in the way that only this place healed it. The world was at peace. It was enough. It had always been enough. He understood this now, from here, looking back at the long road that had produced this moment. The going anyway had been enough. The not wanting had been enough. Sam not leaving had been enough. The 8 who came out of Moria had been enough. Not easy. Not what anyone would have chosen. But enough, in the specific sense that matters, the sense that means, the world survived. The light continued. The small things that were worth protecting were protected. The third age was over. The fourth age was living itself out on the other side of the sea. The Malon tree was growing in Hobbiton. The line of Isildur had come home. The ring was ash and the eye was dark, and in the mountain where the fire had burned there was no fire anymore, only the quiet of a place that had held something terrible for a very long time and had finally been relieved of it. It was over. It had been enough. And in the silence of the ending, in the specific quality of silence that follows the resolution of something that has been unresolved for a very long time, the world rested. For now, and for a while, the world rested.